Recording. All right, we are live.
Alrighty, welcome to the Judicial Review podcast today of the
Yes.
Statecraft series. So I'm here with Sonic. My name is Delta.
Yep. Yep.
We're going to discuss a couple things today.
Yep. Yep.
What were the topics I said specifically? I know we were going to talk about the Supreme Court in the Supreme Court Colorado, how it came down 9-0.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit about judicial review, and then too bad he's not here, but we had a fellow who wanted to talk about the Armada tank, how it wasn't going to be deployed to Ukraine, and how apparently they may be shutting down production. So, what are your thoughts, Sonic, about our first topic about
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court? Yeah, what do
Uh,
you think?
I mean, it's just our process doing whatever. But there's still a lot of stuff to happen. Uh, in regards to all of Trump's legal shit. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's really two takes on this. There's everyone who's freaking out. Trump Trump won this Supreme Court hearing. Our democracy is at risk because the insurrectionists have won. And then there's everyone else who's like, well, this had to have happened this way because he wasn't actually convicted. Like, I don't know, man. I've been making this prediction for months, literally months, that the Supreme Court was going to come down on the side of Trump. I predicted 9-0, like, because yeah, he got the second impeachment and they did impeach him the second time, but the Senate didn't convict. And if the Senate doesn't convict, did the president do anything wrong? I mean, legally, I think that's how it is. I think that's how our Constitution was written. Like, the president, unless he gets convicted by the Senate, is de facto within the bounds of the law to do whatever he's doing.
Yeah. But like I said, there's still a lot of stuff to happen. A lot of court proceedings. There's a lot of felony charges. It's stuff in New York that passed, where he was convicted and has to pay millions.
Well, okay, so that stuff isn't one. That stuff isn't criminal, so he
Yeah.
can't face jail time for it,
Well,
anything
no.
like that. It's all civil business liability stuff.
Yeah, but it's gonna
I
hurt.
mean,
It'll hurt him. It'll hurt him somewhat.
it'll hurt him, but it's nothing like. I mean, calling Trump an insurrectionist when he wasn't convicted of insurrection, that is a big thing, and the fact that the Supreme Court tacitly said, well, he's not really an insurrectionist because he wasn't convicted in the Senate. I mean, the
Well,
argument's kind of over. There's nothing else to say about it.
I think one of the problems with convicted with insurrection is that, from my knowledge, no one's been convicted of insurrection in the U.S. So there's not a
Mhm.
direct clause for what is insurrection.
Yeah, all the J6ers, most of them were convicted of either
Trespass.
incitement of a riot,
Yeah.
trespass, which is a misdemeanor, which is crazy because a lot of them have been held literally for like 3 years at this point without charge or trial. Well, I mean, with charge but no trial, because there's a lot of them, and the court system was backed up a little bit. But like a lot of them are held literally for like 3 years, and I've heard horror stories. How believable are all of them? Did literally every single one go into solitary confinement? I don't know, but I mean, a lot of them were held in prison, in federal
Yeah.
prison, which is not a fun place for
No.
a misdemeanor.
No.
So.
I think they were probably. I'm not even pro Trump, but I think, for the most part, some of them were mishandled, for sure. But I mean, they did riots and they did try to overthrow it in some aspect. So.
Well, I mean, that is okay. I mean, that I do agree with the riot, but overthrowing the government, I mean, what does that mean? And were they trying to do it? I mean, I would
Well,
agree that their purpose was to stop the vote,
yeah,
but is
and
that overthrowing the government?
well, I think some people went there with that intention of overthrowing, and most of
Oh,
them, and
definitely.
a lot of people definitely got caught up in everything, for sure. But still, rioting against the already democratic process is a terrible thing.
Well, I mean, okay, I agree and disagree because if you do believe that, I mean, and I genuinely believe most of them thought the election was stolen,
Yeah,
whatever that means, for whatever that means, who cares? But they genuinely believe that the election was stolen, and they were going there to voice their opinion, which I mean, in school in America, we're taught that like it's our God-given right to scream at the government and things like that.
yeah. But there's a difference between protesting and in a sense attacking the building to stop the vote.
Look, I mean, I think the riot was definitely, I mean, optically, just optically driven. It's funny because 2020 was like the right wingers, and I'm not a right winger, but the right wingers were saying, "Oh, look at the left wingers riot during 2020 with, you know, the George Floyd riots." And then
Mhm.
I personally witnessed the riots in downtown Portland at that courthouse. I talk about it all the time with you about how I saw an old woman have a firecracker thrown at her and explode at her feet. And you know, the right was all high and mighty for that whole year until January 6th, and then you know things got out of hand. So
And it's really funny because a lot of them were saying like, "Oh yeah, if we lost the election," because after Hillary lost and people were upset about that, right wingers all on large were being like, "Oh, if we lost, we would just go back to work and not care." And then what happened? The complete opposite. So that's pretty funny.
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, no, it is pretty funny, and it is kind of ironic because it just goes to show that everyone just nakedly wants power. Nobody actually really, I mean, they don't really actually care about the process. They
Yeah,
just nakedly want power.
I
So
think it's sad. We should definitely care about a process more than
yeah,
candidates. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, the process is what keeps things fair because it, as we always talk about with Rawls, as you and I always talk about with Rawls, if you would want it done to you, we should do it to the other side. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the fact that J6 happened at all is terrible. But to go back to overthrowing the government, I don't necessarily think. Again, did every single person there want to overthrow the
No.
government? No, but were there people there that were? Maybe, and I wouldn't mind throwing those people in jail forever
Hmm.
because I don't believe overthrowing the government is the best thing to do
Yeah. Uh,
necessarily. I mean,
and there's
oh,
still a
go
lot
ahead.
of and there's a lot of other stuff that Trump did as well that kind of raises suspicion on his intentionality in revolves to cooing
Like
the
what?
government. Well, as we talked about before, with fake electors, him trying to use Mike Pence
Hmm.
to basically throw out votes, electoral college votes.
Yeah, I'm still like you did convince me that one time when we talked about the fake electors thing because nobody else before had really explained it because I for context, I used to believe that the fake electors plot was not something that was possible. I argued that what is a fake elector and things like that.
Yeah.
And I do credit you with really showing me the light on how silly that was. But I'm still like 80% in agreement with you, but I still have as our good friend would say, I'm questioning things, but I
Yeah.
think, you know, I do think that Trump doing the fake electors thing was nefarious, you
Yeah.
know.
And then
It
him
was bad
using
intentioned.
Mike Pence to overthrow basically just remove electoral college votes altogether to put it into the House, which was majority Republican, to force him back into power. I think that would also be
I will
classified as a coup.
Yeah, I will say what we should do after January 6th and all these issues is I'm not saying we should codify federal election law because I do like how every state does it, but for like the counting of votes and things like that, it should be like I know there's like federal laws on it, but like a lot of people, including myself included, kind of think of federal law as more nebulous and like we should have a constitutional amendment that really dictates how the process needs to work. Like
Yeah.
without because I'm a constitutionalist. I believe the Constitution is law, and everything else is just a friendly suggestion.
Yeah. I just think it's scary that people are actually considering voting in someone as crazy as Trump.
Well, I mean, I agree, but that's literally every single politician we've ever had ever, like
Well, I think
George Bush, Barack Obama.
sure. Well, Biden overall has been fairly mild. He's been tame, and I like that
I mean, what do you mean
overall.
by mild and tame? Because I mean, he's engaged in a very aggressive inflationary or not or, sorry, his the Federal Reserve is engaged in very inflationary policies and things like that.
Well, yeah.
And he I mean, he's done what every other president has done, which is
Well,
increase the federal budget, increase the power of the federal government. Like,
you kind of have with the federal uh anyways, the money stuff, the president doesn't have any control over that with the Federal Reserve. They kind of
yeah,
just do their own thing, and then the president and Congress have to in a sense fix like raise national the debt ceiling. because of everything going on. But I mean,
I
like,
mean, go ahead.
well,
Sorry,
I mean, like
sorry for
overall,
interrupting.
no, you're fine. Interrupt me, I interrupt you. So just interrupt me as much as you want. But he's fairly mild in terms of like his bipartisanship. Yeah, he has some weird rhetoric when it comes to specifically Trump supporters, but I mean, if they tried to coup the government, or at least their leader tried to coup the government, then it's probably okay to have some rhetoric against that ideology.
I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm of the opinion America was never united, and it's like all the stuff that says America's united is a big psyop. But I mean, at the same time, I really don't like my leaders saying those people ought to be in jail, even though I'm not one of those people. Like, I just don't like that idea. Like, I think the federal government everyone needs to go weapons down. Like let's calm down for a second, everybody, which is impossible. But
Yeah, but I'd say overall Biden has done a pretty good job trying to keep things tame to uh, keep tensions a little more down. But the Trump supporters, the MAGA movement, is trying to rile everyone up because that's what populists tend to do.
yeah, well, and I'm not a fan of populism, so I mean, I don't like Trump,
Yeah.
but to get back to the Supreme Court case, I do find it interesting because in the actual, I mean, I don't have it up, but I was kind of reading through through what their decision was. Do you know how Supreme Court? I'm kind of a law nerd. I'm actually thinking about going to law if my current career path doesn't work out. But do you know how Supreme Court hearings work and how decisions come down and things like that?
Is it just like a regular court? And instead of a jury of peers, it's they're kind of the jury and they're the ones that decide. Uh, is it something like
Kind
that?
of. So do you know how an appellate court works? Do you know what that is?
Appellate courts.
Okay, so an appellate court. So when you go to court, you have you have your judge. And it depends on what kind of court you go to. So if you have a jury trial, you have your jury. If you don't have a jury trial, if the judge is making a decision, the judge is the jury basically. But when you go to court, the judge or the jury will have a decision, and then that comes down, and that's whatever. Every defendant has a right to appeal, and that's what appellate courts are. They're an appeals court. Appeal, appellate, same thing. Okay, so
Okay.
you have in the U.S. you have the Supreme Court, which is like the head appellate court of everything federal, and even to a certain extent some state things maybe not. I mean, it's a little complicated. The Supreme Court doesn't really rule on state things necessarily, except in this Colorado case, obviously. But it's a federal state thing, so it's a little different. But and then the court has circuits and stuff, and the justices are in charge of the circuits. But so the Supreme Court is like the buck stops with the Supreme Court, and how things work now with judicial review is that if there is a circuit split, or if there is, which means one circuit has one ruling about a case, and then there's a similar case in another circuit, and they have different outcomes of the circuit. That's a circuit split. Goes to the Supreme Court because you can't have two federal circuits disagreeing on what the law means. Make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
And then another purpose of the Supreme Court is to settle. There's three main purposes of the Supreme Court. It's to settle disputes between the branches of the federal government. So usually between the president and the Senate, or the Congress, to settle disputes between the states and the federal government, and then to settle disputes between the states, and I guess settle disputes between people and the federal government. But four main purposes of the Supreme Court. So um, circuit split, and then the second thing is when people have disputes, or when states have disputes between the states and the federal government, which is what's going on right now because Trump he was the president, and his issue is a federal issue. But obviously, Colorado was messing around by saying you can't run for president in the state of Colorado, or you can't be on the ballot, which is
Yeah.
essentially de facto saying you can't run for president. Make sense?
Yeah. Looks like our mutual friend came through. All right. Hop on in, McGuire. There
Hop
we go.
in. Mr. McGuire. Mr.
Finally.
McGuire.
I
Real
love.
quick. Oh, go ahead.
No, you're good. Go for it. Go for it.
Just to catch you up, so we're talking about the Trump Colorado ballot thing right now.
Yep.
Um, and basically I was discussing with Sonic about how the Supreme Court works very broadly. It's very complicated. I'm trying to give context to what's going on right now. And basically, I said that like part of the Supreme Court's job is to settle disputes between the state and the federal government, which Trump was the federal president, and his being taken off the ballot is a federal issue. Make sense?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I completely follow.
Yeah. And so when the court makes a decision, each justice there's a couple different ways that it can work. Each justice can write an opinion, either agreeing or dissenting to what they all they write letters to each other and they write little memos to each other, kind of during the hearing about there's a hearing and they hear arguments from both sides, and then when they go into chambers, the justices go into chambers, they write memos to each other, basically arguing what they think the law means in this case and all sorts of stuff. And so in this case, none of the justices dissented, and I've heard on the underground that actually the three quote unquote liberal, or I call them progressive judges, were actually they were still going to agree with the overall thing, but they were going to softly dissent with the thing, but there's no soft dissent. Although
no, I heard that too.
Yeah. But the four female justices each had kind of a minor disagreement. They basically said that like the overall opinion was that like Colorado, that the 14th Amendment basically says that Colorado can't interfere in federal elections. Colorado has to go along with whatever the federal election is. Whereas the four female justices said that they did agree to a certain extent that like insurrection was kind of self-executing, and so there was that question on whether or not Trump is an insurrectionist. But as Sonic and I discussed earlier, the Senate didn't convict after the second impeachment for insurrection, and I don't even think he was charged, if I recall correctly. So it's a moot point, anyways.
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
No, I know what you're talking about with the soft dissent thing. I think I saw PBS. I think they mentioned it, that the three justices you talked about said that they thought that the court should just strike it down and then not take any positions past that. Just say, well, the 14th Amendment prohibits offices other than the president from taking a position, so it's a moot point. It doesn't concern the president. But I heard that too, but I didn't know if that was official or not. So.
Yeah, that was in the dissent, or that was in the opinion, basically.
Gotcha.
It's kind of amazing because you don't really see the court too much ever come out as strongly as it does. Like before 2016, the court would come out actually more often than not more unified. It wouldn't be necessarily 9-0, but it would be like 8-1 or 7-2. It was actually very rare that 5-4 decisions came down. And then after 2016, obviously it's been 5-4, 5-4, and then recently 6-3, 6-3. It's kind of amazing to see the court come out and even begrudgingly all agree, yeah, Trump should be on the ballot.
No, it definitely makes a statement, to be sure.
Go ahead, Sonic.
I just was agreeing. Yeah, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because if the court is saying this about Trump and insurrection for a second impeachment, I'm kind of curious. I'm of the opinion that with the presidential immunity stuff, they're going to say something similar. I think it's going to be a lot more fractious. I don't think it's going to be a 9-0 decision necessarily, but I think when his immunity claim stuff goes through, it gets up to them because they're going to hear it soon. I'm pretty sure that a similar outcome, but it's not going to be quite as unified, so to speak. But I think the court is going to rule that if you don't convict, the president is immune.
No, for sure. I think I definitely agree with that. I looking at how things are going.
Yeah.
I think it rides a certain line to be sure. But I think that seems consistent with this ruling.
Any opinion, Sonic?
I mean, yeah, begrudgingly, you kind of have to agree, like, okay, the states can't quite say anything yet until everything's been seen and looked through on the federal level.
Yeah. But and then I was thinking about this because I know Sonic knows how much I rage against judicial review, and on my website that I write on, I've written many times about how I actually hate judicial review, and I don't like how the Supreme Court is basically like this arbiter of what the Constitution means. And so I have a spicy take, which is I don't think judicial review is actually a thing. It's not in the Constitution. So while this decision is amazing for Trump and it's really funny that all this is happening, I really actually don't care in the long run, and I don't think it's actually something that ought to have happened in the first place.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. It didn't even come about until what, the 1820s, correct? So
No. It was when John Adams was leaving office, and
oh right.
Thomas Jefferson was coming in. It was Marbury versus Madison, and
Yep.
Marbury was appointed by Adams. I forget what position, but he was appointed by Adams for some position, and he was appointed literally the day Adams was leaving, and Jefferson came in, and he basically he took the letter, because this is the 1800s. He took the letter and just didn't send it, and so Marbury said, "Hey, I actually was appointed to this," and there was a whole kerfuffle. And it's really funny because the actual court case of Marbury versus Madison, like the ruling was kind of whatever, like, okay, cool. But like Justice Marshall basically is like, oh yeah, by the way, it's just implied in Article 3 that we get to review what the Constitution means. And us justices, at the time it was, I think it was us seven justices get to determine what it means, and what we say goes. And I'm just, 200 and I think, how far are we along? 235 years later, something like that. I'm just sitting
Yep.
here like, how is that possible? Where did he? And I think his arguments are very flimsy, because he basically says that like courts have always decided what laws are, and I'm sitting here thinking actually courts don't decide what laws are. And in fact, whether it's a jury trial or a bench trial, which is where the judge listens in on it, the judge actually in theory isn't supposed to know what the law is. I mean, the judge probably does, but like the lawyers or the plaintiff and the defendant are actually supposed to argue to the judge or the jury what the law means. And they, because we're a common law system, it's based on precedent. So in theory, not even like the only people who can determine what the law is are the people that commonly live under the law. So that's why I'm very against judicial review, and I don't like the Supreme Court being. I don't like how it's basically nine oligarchs deciding what the law means.
Yeah. We should
Yeah, I
definitely have
think
a more consistent system. So, like just like if all the judges were Democrat, they would all interpret it in a way a Democrat would, and then vice versa with Republican, and you just end up with what for one administration it's this, and for another one it's this, and it's too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's literally the problem. Like, we had literally the Dred Scott decision, which said black people are not American citizens, and if you know, even if they escape to the North, they're still technically property under Northern law. They're not property of their slave owners, but according to Dred Scott, like, your property in the South, you were property in the South. Under Korematsu, if you were Japanese, you were a suspicious alien that needs to be locked up in a concentration camp, an unironic concentration camp. And it doesn't matter if you're an American. If you're suspicious of being Japanese, you're a potential enemy combatant, and we can treat you as such. And I don't think that's right. Like, I mean, we always rail here about how due process is very important, and I don't think the Supreme Court gets to delete that just because nine justices say that's how it is.
Yeah.
right. There's a
Um,
disconnect too from the actual self governance of America, right? The aspect of people voting on things, right? When you have these individuals who are literally appointed indirectly, there's no involvement of the American public in that. Um, that's kind of a concern too, because now it's not even like, oh, you're democratically agreeing to this tyrannical system. It's literally uh, something that's above our heads completely. It's wholly isolated from American
yeah,
voters. Yeah.
yeah, I do agree, and the isolation thing is very important because we treat these justices as if they're kind of these demigod figures who are apolitical and, you know, they only call balls and strikes. But I mean, that's not true at all. Like, we see all the time justices do very political things. I hate Justice, our Chief Justice right now, John Roberts, because I think he's very, again, I don't like judicial review at all, but even in the case of what he does, I think he's very limp wristed, and he's more concerned about the appearance that the Supreme Court is. He's more concerned about the appearance of the Supreme Court and what people think of the Supreme Court rather than doing what the right thing is. Now that's subjective. I think, you know, we all disagree here to a certain extent what the right thing is, but
Yeah.
Right.
um I I like, it's very political, and I don't like that people. It's like I said at the beginning with Sonic, everyone is freaking out right now about they're freaking like there's a bunch of people who are freaking out about this decision, and like I heard Keith Olbermann say, you know, we need to disband the Supreme Court and things like that. And it's like, well, okay, I don't like judicial review, but I'm not for just like full blown revolution just because they made one decision you didn't like, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of reactions like that if you look historic or in the last several years. I know when Thomas was being appointed, everybody liked to call him Uncle Tom. That was a big thing for a while. And it's like, okay, well, you can see how the system is problematic, right? You can see how a president getting, you know, this weird unilateral authority to appoint somebody without any accountability to the American public. People obviously see there's an issue with that. You can see how there's a problem with letting these people hold this office for, you know, until they decide to seat it, right? Literally lifetime appointments. People obviously take issue to that, but there's no actual like advocation to do anything about it. It's always offhand remarks like, "Oh well, Thomas is horrible. This is bad," but nobody tries to fix the system. Um, I think that's pretty problematic, and it is reflective of a lot of American politics right now. Everybody, you know, picks some political side, and then they say, "Well, they're putting, you know, a Republican on the Supreme Court. This is horrible. Oh my God, you know, super bad. Blah blah blah." And then they don't do anything about it. Nobody tries to suggest a solution. It's a problem for a day, then it leaves the Twitter feeds, um, and then that's it. That's the last you hear about
Well,
the Supreme Court. So
isn't one of the problems is that with what we were talking about earlier, me and Delta, where it's the Rawlsian take. You don't want it to happen to you. So if we try to fix, if a Democrat were trying to fix the Republican problem, then they're just going to do the same thing with them, and they would rather have the system they currently have.
It's actually kind of a reverse Rawls, because the reason why they don't offer any solutions, and why like my take of we need to get rid of judicial review will never be you know, taken up, is because judicial review allows for one of the branches of the government to very powerfully affect how law in the country works. So, like we saw with Roe versus Wade back in the 70s, the court basically unilaterally forced every state in the U.S. to legalize abortion, whether the people of the state wanted it legal or not. Like and you know, there's an argument to be made on whether that was the right thing or not. But the Supreme, or like with Dred Scott or Korematsu or whatever, the Supreme Court unilaterally did that, and there's no check on that. Like, or I mean, maybe there's a soft check on you can impeach the justices who made that decision, but we've only impeached one justice ever. I'm pretty sure, and even if you impeach the justices, in theory, you would have to have another court hearing on that issue, you know, and then the court would have to rule, and you have to assume that they're going to overturn that rule, and that's a big gamble, and that doesn't happen too often, to be honest. Like, the court really just like, common law is very powerful at affirming what is in precedent, and it's very rare that stare decisis is stood against, and that someone, you know, a court is willing to stand against stare decisis in a very principled way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But like, just in general, I do agree that, like, I mean, there's a lot with the Constitution that needs to be reformed, and Article 3 is the shortest article in the Constitution for the three branches of government. It's funny, Article 1, which is the one about the legislative branch, is the longest, and then Article 3 is like half as long or something. It literally has half as many words, and it doesn't even say like how many people need to be on the court, where they come from. It just kind of vaguely talks about what their overall broad jurisdiction is, basically, and what they can and can't do.
Yeah.
And there's a lot they can do, and there's not much they can't do.
Maybe we could have a system where you elect justices. I think that would be the people elect the justice directly, like how we do with every other branch, basically.
Yeah, or maybe, I mean, another one that I was thinking of, or that was originally, I think it was John Jay. I forget, but one of them talked about how basically like Supreme Court duty would be kind of like jury duty for, I mean, obviously for the elite class at the time and things like that. But like basically the Supreme Court would have been jury duty, and you get your jury duty summons to go to the Supreme Court and hear a case, and it's just randomly selected. I think that would be a lot better than what it is now, where we have 9 justices who, until they literally die, are just sitting there forever.
Yeah. No, I don't necessarily like that one as much. I think maybe just electing them instead of just be random people go and just hear a case like a jury duty, because then it puts a lot of strain on individuals who may not even know anything.
I suppose. I mean, listen, I'm not saying my solution is perfect. I'm just saying like there like
Something's better than nothing.
so Article 3, well, like I said, so Article 3, it doesn't specify who needs to serve on the court or how they're selected. I mean, it does say that, you know, the president needs to select it and the Senate needs to confirm, but
Yeah.
I mean, outside of that, we don't most Supreme Court justices come from the federal court system. Usually they're a circuit judge of some sort. Usually they're at the head of the circuit or something like that. And oh, one sec, I'm getting a call. Can I take this? I really need to take this. Can you guys keep talking?
Sure.
All right.
Uh-oh. Anyways, so what are you thinking, McGuire?
No, I definitely agree. I think it's a problematic system, and it doesn't get talked about enough because, like I said, people will have their political hot button topics every few years where it's like, oh, the court has failed us. This is horrible, and then that's about the end of it, right? So I don't think that there's much civic awareness around even how it functions, what it does, what role it plays, what role it should play. And so I think that's an issue. It's very divorced from American society. Sure. It's divorced from American voters, and something with that level of power over the federal government really shouldn't be. I mean, it's very antithetical to the rest of the structure of the government.
But what would your solution be to that then? Like what me or Delta talked about, or would you have your own solution?
Sure, I like the jury duty idea. Sounds okay, I suppose. Because it gives a diversity of opinion, right? It makes sure that you don't have these big figureheads sitting on a court who, I'm not accusing anybody of corruption, but in the last few months, right, there's stories coming out about trips happening and payments being made and whatever, right? When you have these figureheads who are appointed who have conflicts of interest because of political affiliations, that creates an issue, right? So if you have constant circulation through the Supreme Court, I think that lowers the risk, or I suppose the probability of somebody being bought out, something happening, some sort of organization going on that undermines the integrity of the court, right? So I like that idea, but like you said, putting random Americans in this super powerful seat doesn't seem like a great idea either. Ultimately, you look at Supreme Court decisions and how fundamentally they affect society. It's a massive responsibility. So I think that the intermediate would maybe be something like federal judges, right? They're randomly selected federal judges on a case by case basis, where you have somebody who does have knowledge of the legal system, right? You have somebody who is practicing in this, who theoretically has competencies in discussing law, understanding nuances in law, understanding nuances in these issues. But you're making sure that it's not a set of people who continuously hold this power, right? I don't know how many federal judges there are right now, but certainly more than 9, right? So by circulating through the pool of federal judges, I think it helps get rid of some of that I don't know how to phrase it, the stagnation of power on certain people, if that makes sense.
So couldn't well, we could maybe do federal districting. So maybe like have a collection of states all have a certain amount of seats that could go into the court, and then the people within those federal districts could vote people in for who they see fit, and then maybe every 8 years it gets switched.
No, definitely reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is making sure that you can cycle through the individuals in the court and keep creating some sort of accountability to the American public.
Yeah.
Having these, untouchable figureheads, I think on paper is a great idea because you don't want your justices to face retribution or face some sort of fallback for their decisions. So I think I've heard it before. Like Delta said, it's not outlined well in the Constitution, but I think there is logic in having a sitting lifetime judge who doesn't have to worry about the implications of their decisions in terms of their career, in terms of their livelihood, and so forth. But I think it's also a failure because there's so much power being put on that position. So creating some sort of accountability, I think, is a must. It's a compromise between
accountability, definitely. Make it instead of lifetime limited, and then have term limits, of course. I think these would all be very important things, and then better outline what they can and can't do, placing less power overall with the federal.
No, absolutely. I think that's consistent with the entirety of the federal government. I think a lot of issues come down to very old people maintaining a position in an office for a lot longer than they have any business doing.
He's back.
Who achieve demigod status.
Yeah. He's back.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
My new job is I've been calling them all day and they just got back to me and I had to take that call. So I apologize.
You're good. You're good. No, that's fine. We were just basically.
So what's going on?
We were just basically dick writing each other about both agreeing that placing less power on the federal, maybe having term limits and setting a certain amount of time. I given maybe federal districting, so a collection of states can vote in either one or a couple justices. And
yeah,
and
we
then,
already.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and then,
keep going.
And then maybe they go like 8 years or so, and then they get voted out. Maybe it's one term, and then you get new justices.
Yeah, I mean, we already have federal circuits now. Maybe they need to be adjusted a little bit, but we already have federal circuits, so there's no reason we can't, do what you're saying basically right now. We can't implement it.
Well, they don't. The government tends to not want to limit its power, right? So by placing these restrictions, you are restricting their power.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was saying earlier. Judicial review is just this unilateral way of affecting the Constitution. So why would they want to take it apart? Why exactly? So, I mean, basically, the only thing we can do now is go to people and say, hey, have you heard about how the federal, the Supreme Court can just kind of do whatever it wants? And that's not good, right? Maybe we should have some accountability. And it's funny because I like Justice Thomas, but I mean, I was watching a Mr. Beat video. Do you know who Mr. Beat is?
Yeah, I watch him. I watch him every once in a while.
What about you, McGuire?
He's muted. Oh.
I'm not familiar, no.
Okay, so Mr. Beat, he's a school teacher. I think he's in Indiana. I don't remember exactly, but he's a school teacher, and he ranks Supreme Court justices, and he ranked Thomas as the third worst in all of U.S. history, which is really amazing. But he said he was super corrupt and things like that, and I don't think Justice Thomas is corrupt. But I mean, listen, I'm a fallible person, so maybe my take is not necessarily the best. So, if you guys think Justice Thomas is corrupt, let's impeach him. Let's set up a system to get these, let's get corrupt people out.
Yeah,
I'm not against that.
Make it easier to impeach. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. How about we change gears like a tank and shift? So I know McGuire wanted to talk about this one because he's more into open source intelligence, but so Russia recently stated that it would not deploy their T-14 Armata tank. We can go into what it is later, but it's their new generation of main battle tank to Ukraine, and they cited cost reasons, which is not a good thing to say when you're in a protracted forever war, basically their version of Afghanistan, on steroids. So, McGuire, do you have better information on that? I think you would personally, because you're more connected to that than I am, and I'm fairly connected. So,
I haven't dove specifically into that statement, but I think it's been on the cards since 2014. I mean, even before 2014, you can get into whether or not they were able to actually effectively produce T-14s and supply them and sustain them in a combat environment. But after 2014, sanctions hit the Russian state, and you can see a profound impact in military production, just incredible impact. Permanently stagnated growth. Not even growth. They've fully regressed, right? You look at their blackjack fleet, right? The Tu-160s. They've been modernizing some test aircraft that were produced in the 80s and theoretically producing new airframes, and they've only been able to achieve a modernization rate of like one aircraft per year, and this is just swapping out avionics. And
yeah,
this is something that they've identified as an important strategically significant endeavor, right? Because it's one of their frontline strategic bombers, and they can only manage to modernize one aircraft per year. So then you look at tanks, and obviously, a tank is maybe a little less in terms of cost and so forth, expensive
it's a
relative
big
to
metal box in theory.
right. But the equipment that they're putting in these, the metallurgy that goes into developing this next generation armor, the even manufacturing ball bearings for the turrets, that's something that I read a report on a while back. Ball
It's a big
bearings,
deal.
they've just lost the manufacturing ability and the ability to import just
They
across
were.
the
I
board.
heard they were shipping them from China, which is
Right.
not good.
Right. No, absolutely. And even then, there's resistance to importing from China. So it's gotten to the point where frontline Russian units are using off the shelf, American electronics. You can see it in aircraft photos and so forth. They're using Garmin's for navigation, right?
In their
Um,
freaking fighters while they're on
exactly.
mission.
Exactly, and this isn't a new thing, right? It was happening in Syria. It was happening in when they'd release interception videos before Ukraine happened, and literally first day of the Ukraine invasion, some of the combat footage that they were releasing as propaganda literally had Su-34s that have their own internal navigation system, right? They have a fully digital cockpit. They still had consumer GPSs in there because they're not able to
like
maintain
like stuff
the
you'd go
onboard.
hiking with.
Right, exactly, exactly. Um, so suffice to say that the Russian military procurement system is in a very poor state. So it's been clear for years that the T-14 is not going to see frontline service. Even 2018, when they were putting it on parade in Moscow, there were several high-profile incidents where, during their Victory Day parades, the T-14s and similar vehicles from the same combat vehicle development program were breaking down on parade. They had to get them towed out of the square because they're not able to produce transmissions and engines and so forth that can actually power and reliably, maintain these vehicles. So it's been clear for a while. It's interesting to hear it finally said point blank, but I don't think anybody who's seriously looked at the situation has doubted that that's the level that it's been at. Russia's theoretically still producing them. I don't remember off the top of my head the production figures. I think they're aiming for 50 within the next decade. I think officially their T-14 fleet is at like 20, 25 tanks, counting prototypes. Officially, so take that with a grain of salt. But it is still in production. Contrary to what certain propagandists would say about Russia producing the T-90 instead. Um, so they're in this weird in between where they're not willing to let go of the T-14 and similar pattern tanks, um, because it would be a massive propaganda loss. So they're still producing it, but obviously they can't sustain it in combat. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting situation to look at, and it doesn't bode well for the Russian military industrial complex. I mean, it really reflects very poorly on them, but.
Yeah.
So let's catch Sonic up real quick because he's not an open source nerd like we are. So
No.
for one, it's Armata with a T, not Armada. Mr. Sonic.
Okay.
That's okay. You're not into this stuff as much as we are. You're not as big of a nerd about it.
No.
But secondly, so the T-14 is their newest generation of main battle tank, and
Okay.
basically what that means is it's their new, it's the new hot big gun in a metal box. And when it came out years ago, like back in 2013, 2014, what made it revolutionary is it went to a single man turret design, which most tanks have a 2-man turret, or even a 3-man turret, and or yeah, they have a 3-man turret. Usually, like the Abrams, for example, is a 3-man. It's 4 crew in total: uh, driver, a gunner, a commander, and then a loader. Russian tanks usually have an auto loader, and there's trade-offs. There's benefits and trade-offs to having an auto loader versus a person who loads the tank round, manually. But that was revolutionary because it made the turret of the tank really, really small and thin. And tanks, the biggest one of the biggest weaknesses of a tank is if you have a really fat turret, it's really easy to hit it. And if you can hit the turret, you're probably going to kill the tank, or your chances of killing the tank are much greater. So if you have a thinner turret, it makes it a lot easier or a lot more difficult to kill. And they did this because they had all these advanced like computers and stuff in it that would help the commander, so the commander didn't have to be in the turret with the gunner, basically. And as McGuire was saying, this makes it, like, it makes production more difficult because you have to source lots of microchips, which with the current sanctions in Russia, it's been very hard for them to get advanced microchips. Like they can get cheap calculator microchips from China all day long, but you need these very complex integrated circuits that have fairly big CPUs in them, fairly beefy CPUs that can do the calculations you need to fire a tank round and things like that.
Okay.
So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
It sounds like fun.
and well, it is fun, but like, I mean, listen, the problem is though, is that like this does not bode well overall for Russia in the
Yeah.
Ukraine war. Like, I wanted to bring this up because I thought you would be fairly interested in how the war was going in Ukraine and things like that, because they've been at a stalemate for a while, and the Russians have been threatening to deploy this new super tank onto the battlefield, and now that's not going to happen because, as McGuire said, their production is slow and their refit and repair process is basically non-existent because
Yeah.
if they can't source parts to build the tank, how are you going to source parts to fix a tank that breaks down or even undergoes routine maintenance?
Yeah. Do you think Ukraine has a chance of winning at this point?
Right now, I mean, that's a bigger question. What do you mean by win? Can
As
you
in,
describe to me what you're imagining with a win scenario is?
probably push them out of mainland. Well, it's currently mainland, and then maybe even Crimea, and taking that back.
I would say no.
No.
Right now, with as things are working, no. What do you think, McGuire?
No, I agree. There's been a lot of talk in Ukraine recently about lowering the draft age. So they theoretically have hundreds of thousands. I think the figure I've heard before is like 700,000 draftable men under 27, but their draft age is 27 and up. So theoretically, they have manpower remaining. The issue with that is obviously it's politically unsavory to draft a very large segment of the population like that. But then it creates a demographics issue with whether or not Ukraine can support itself when you're throwing your entire young into a meat grinder, right? So they're in a weird precarious spot where they have resources theoretically to commit to larger offensives and commit to a larger war, if you want to put it like that. But they can't necessarily use that. And then at the same time, from the Western perspective, aid has been slowing down a little bit. I know, especially in the United States, there's been a push to decrease funding to Ukraine, and that's kind of slowly been happening because it's clear that the situation has stagnated a little bit. Russia's exhausted a lot of their resources. They'll say that they haven't, but they entered general mobilization years ago. They've started deploying 60-year-old tanks. I think I saw one image on Twitter. Somebody tracked down an actual serial number and exact model of a tank that rolled into Czechoslovakia years ago.
During the Prague Spring, right?
Yeah, during Prague Spring, was spotted on the Ukrainian front line. That's the predicament Russia's in right now. So on both sides, they're in a very, very, very poor material state. Russia more so. Ukraine is just, it has its hands tied, I think, in how they proceed. So I think that means that going forward, barring any major offensives, it's going to remain in the equilibrium it's in right now. And I don't see Ukraine being able to push out of that without tapping into more manpower. That's, ultimately what it comes down to. You need more manpower to accomplish large scale mobilized warfare things. The other aspect of it is artillery, right? Artillery, big in Slavic military doctrine. Massive reserves across the world of 155 millimeter shells are slowly becoming critically depleted to the point where things like that, what you might consider very basic warfighting materials that Ukraine is using at an astronomical rate, we literally can't supply anymore, right? It's getting to the point where it is pushing on the brink of being a national security issue for the United States, because it's like, hey, we have our own armed forces, we have our own military needs, we can't exhaust all of our ammunition to support Ukraine. So the push from Ukraine, from nations supporting Ukraine, is to keep it in an equilibrium as it is right now. Russia, their push is going to be to maintain that equilibrium, not because they want to, but because they literally cannot change.
They can't push.
Yeah, exactly. So it's gonna stay the way it is. I foresee the conflict staying the way it's been in Donetsk for the last 7-8 years since 2014. It's been not a dynamic front line. It's been trenches, right? And I think it's going to stay that way. It's going to just be more along the entirety of the Ukrainian border with Russia now, rather than just that one breakout region. But
it just seems like a war of attrition. Whoever basically runs out of materials or manpower is the one that's going to lose.
Right.
Yeah, and it's funny because you would think that Ukraine would not be running out of war materials because it has the support of basically NATO, and NATO is gigantic.
Yeah.
And I mean, Russia is no slouch. I mean, it was no slouch when it came to production, but I mean, the sanctions, as we discussed, have had a massive impact on their production. But it's funny because the U.S. It's basically the U.S. and the U.K. that are the big guns of NATO. And I mean, you have Poland, you have Estonia, you basically have two big countries, and then you have like 5 small Baltic countries that do any sort of production at scale at all. And the small Baltic countries, they barely do enough production for their military. They actually rely on the U.S. to supply them a lot with a lot of stuff too. And the U.S., ever since the drawdown in Afghanistan, we've really been drawing down our production and things like that. We've been focusing more on kind of testing. Like we have a new rifle and things like that. We're doing stuff since we're in this interwar period or interconflict period. They're doing more like testing rather than actual production, because why produce weapons and supplies, material for things you're going to be replacing in the next 20 years. So
yeah, although it is nice that they're basically getting all of our old equipment and our the testing equipment. So like, oh, here's this new rifle, y'all want to try it out? Y'all want to kill some Russians with it? And these weapons manufacturers are getting a lot of data from this war, so they're giving them the weapons and stuff. So really it looks like Ukraine is running out of manpower and Russia's running out of equipment, and it's whoever fails first.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and it is kind of, it's like McGuire said, it's just gonna be a stalemate, because as long as nothing changes, it will continue as it is forever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Forever, yeah.
But overall, the whole point of this topic of the Armada was the whole reason for it was to discuss the microcosm of how, I mean, Russia is not the boogeyman we thought it was. And it's funny because there's so much popular culture about how Russia is just this endless stream of men and tanks, and whenever they invade whatever, it's just endless. And we've seen with Ukraine, like I've seen pictures of guys being sent not necessarily to the front lines, but like they're doing rear echelon stuff. They're like their maintainers, their cooks, they do stuff like that, laundry technicians, and they're being sent with like Mosin Nagant rifles because,
Mhm.
and it's ridiculous because Russia is seriously getting depleted, really hardcore, and it's actually as a political issue, Russia has always been a very strongly authoritarian state with a very strongly centralized power base, and that power base was derived from military power. And it's really interesting because Russia, I don't think, I mean, it probably has, but I can't think of it. But Russia has seldom ever been conquered from the outside. It normally collapses from within, and normally because the military loses faith, like we saw during World War One, the army literally just turned around on the front line and marched back. And the reason why the Bolshevik Revolution worked is because the army sided with not just the Bolsheviks, but like the White Russians and things like that, and they sided against the Tsars. And it was the same thing with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed because the Politburo basically said we're going to overthrow what's his name, Gorbachev, and the army. Some army units went with it, but the majority of the army units didn't. And in fact, the majority of the army units were not made up of Russians; they were made up of people from all across the Soviet Union, and they just went home as the Soviet Union was collapsing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think a lot of
I think
this.
that touches.
Sorry. I think a lot of this scare
Okay.
about Russia being endless, like, oh, endless men, endless equipment, was from the Soviet Union. And then, especially after its collapse, it lost all of that support and everything.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. That was what I was going to touch on. It's kind of incredible that the idea of Russia being what it is has persisted for so long. If you look pre-Ukraine, right, the entire budget for the Ministry of Defense, right, that's Navy, Air Force, Army, everything, was I talking off the top of my head here, but I want to say around $65 billion US dollars, right, per year. To put that into perspective, the United States is currently committed to spending something around $60 billion per year on its strategic nuclear arsenal alone. So that's the maintenance of our strategic long-range bomber fleet. That not counting B-1s. B-1s aren't considered nuclear capable. So it's just B-52s, B-2s, B-21 development. That's maintenance of the submarine launched ballistic missile fleet, intercontinental ballistic missile fleet, and then
I'm gonna be
obviously
back.
research and development. But
I'll be back.
Keep going. Keep going.
60 billion. We're talking 60 billion. Russia's spending a couple $1 billion more on their entire military versus what the United States spends on nuclear weapons alone. So it's incredible the divide between this idea of Russia being this massive military power and what it actually is. If you look at the numbers, it's very clear. It's not any of that. Like you mentioned, as the Soviet Union fell, right, massive numbers of troops just went back to their home countries, which were not Russia. And you can see this in looking at the Russian military over the last 20 years relative to the Soviet military years prior. It's shrank dramatically, right? And it hasn't been a secret. The Russian military is very tiny relative to the Soviet military in terms of spending, in terms of manpower, in terms of equipment, everything. So it's surprising to me. And granted, I fell into this crowd too, so this is, retrospect is 2020. But it's surprising to me that the narrative of Russia being what it is persisted for so long, because it's pretty clear it's none of that, right? I mean, you look at Ukraine and you ask yourself, what's the motivation for invading Ukraine, for seizing Ukraine? Well, in the Soviet Union, a massive amount of most of the industrial capability was focused in Ukraine, right? Literally, Ukraine holds dry docks that Russian naval flagships have to use, right? They can't physically fit into dry docks anywhere else in Russia. Ukraine holds factories, right? Factories in Ukraine produce engines, produce naval equipment that are necessary for these ships. Russia doesn't have domestic ability to produce this on their own, right? There's a number of different examples where Ukraine on its own is dwarfs Russian industrial capability. Russia is such a shell of what the Soviet Union was, because when you think about it, it is really just an administrative region of the Soviet Union, right? One of what, 15? And it's large, but in terms of manpower, in terms of industrial capability, anything like that, it's literally a 15th of what the Soviet Union was. And so it is incredible that the idea of what Russia was has persisted. I'll say that.
Yeah, I do
There's
agree that.
Mhm.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I was going to say, I do think Russia as it exists today is at least the sheer size of it is a very artificial. It requires will to maintain that, because if you look at just the geography, like everything east of the Urals is really cold and
Mhm.
really desolate, and they don't have much farmland, and so the only way you can but that's where all their major resources are, and so the only way you can really sustain that is if you subsidize it with the Western Russian core basically,
Exactly.
and yeah, it like Russia requires a giant military, and this is why the Soviet Union stayed around for so long, and the Warsaw Pact in general. It was just a hammer to keep people in line in alignment with the Russian core and their objectives, which is why like the Warsaw Pact was never used to invade anyone but other Warsaw Pact nations. And we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, when they go to draft people in the Far East, to take these poor, mining town people who don't have running water or electricity to go fight on the front lines. You see these people actively reject that, and actually you see them fight the government. And it's funny because the Russian government has to take units that were going to the front line to kind of go and occupy these towns to
Mhm.
force these young men to go fight. And it's like, I don't know if you can really sustain a war for that long if you're sending units that need to be going to the front line to relieve units that are, battered and need refit and rearmament. I don't know how long you can keep that up.
No, absolutely.
Mhm.
And I think, especially when you consider the massive losses that Russia's incurred, not just American intelligence. Uh, I recall, I don't have it off the top of my head here, but several months ago, Putin admitted in hundreds of thousands of dead Russian soldiers. Right? There was some. Am I imagining that? I could have sworn there was a TASS article from the Russian Ministry of Defense that publicly acknowledged the just sheer number of losses that they've incurred, which is obviously substantially below what like Western intelligence estimates, but um, it was still astronomical, right? As of December, the United States was saying 315,000 dead or injured troops from Russia. I mean, the, they are not a large country in terms of population, and they're not a large country in terms of military, and they've exhausted a tremendous number of resources. It's not sustainable to continue this war without counting in the fact that these same Russian troops have to do double duty, suppressing their own people too, right? And this isn't new. They're even from the first years of the first year of Ukraine, there were mass shootings at draft centers. There were very
Nobody
famous
talks
videos.
about it.
Yeah, exactly. But they happened. You can find videos dating back to the first months of the war of Russian troops opening fire on protesters in Moscow. And so this isn't a new thing either, right? The Russian military has been fighting essentially a two-front war, albeit not as dramatically in Russia, but they've still been actively, as you've said, employed in suppressing the Russian people, and violently so. So it's very costly in the fact that they're losing so many people, and they have to still commit people to essentially force more troops into the fold. I mean, it's a self-perpetuating cycle that's just going to fail eventually. You can't keep shoveling Russians into this massive furnace and expect it to sustain itself ad nauseum. It's thermodynamics says
Yeah.
you're going to run out of people eventually, right?
From
Yeah, I'm getting serious. Like, oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
I'm
Go
getting
ahead. Go
I'm
ahead,
getting
Sonic.
serious things as well. So I know it's not necessarily great, but the Max AI thing that summarizes everything on like the first page is basically saying with Ukraine there's about
Hmm.
nearly 500,000 casualties. On the Russian side,
Hmm.
uh, it's from a few thousand to 1.5 million, but official sources say 180,000.
Which is insane.
Yeah,
Absolutely insane, yeah. And
even
you got to
Yeah,
figure with an authoritarian government like that, if they're willing to acknowledge losses at large, what's the real number, right?
Well, that's why one of them says
Yeah.
upwards of 1.5 million
Right.
are dead. So I mean, geez, that's crazy.
Yeah, I don't want to say history repeats, but I'm getting serious like end of World War One vibes from
Oh
what's
yeah.
going on right now. Like you have open revolts like we were talking about. You have open revolts at draft centers and army units have to go in and occupy these areas. And it's like I don't it just mind boggles me that anyone thinks that this is sustainable. I'm like Putin kind of like do you guys know who Caspian Report is?
Mm,
I'm
sounds
familiar. Yeah.
familiar. Sounds
Uh,
familiar.
so he does open source intelligence stuff, and he does that, but he also just reads Rand Corporation papers and does videos on them. And he basically said back in 2014 that Putin was not going to back off from Ukraine because his whole legitimacy, not his whole, but a lot of his legitimacy relies on military victories, and so it looked like the Russian military was doing good. Then they do this invasion in 2021, and you know they they push and it looks like they're going to take Ukraine. I thought Ukraine was going to fall and look how wrong I was. But Ukraine, they haven't pushed back. Like I don't think they've pushed back, but
They have. They've
they've
done a
held
little
the
bit.
line, so to speak.
So I think
Well, it
last year or whatever there was like this big push and they did manage to take a lot of Russian land, but it was like a
well,
surprise
what does that
attack.
mean? Like
Yeah, it was a surprise. But what happened is that they tried to do it again and it failed because it was so televised. It was like the Russians knew it was happening,
yeah.
and I think the Russians ended up pushing them back out of that what they had pushed through. So
Yeah. Well, and so my point is that like to go back to what I was saying about Putin and his legitimacy is that Putin is his legitimacy requires him to win military victories, and if he's not winning military victories, he seems less legitimate, which is why you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
riots at draft stations and shootings and
mm-hmm.
things like that. And it's only going to get worse because it's a negative feedback loop where you can't get people to fight, you don't have enough people to fight, and so then you start losing, and then less people want to fight, and then you have less people to fight. And I'm not saying, like I said, I don't think Russia is going to collapse from the outside, but I could foresee basically people within Russia getting very unhappy with how things are going, especially with how garbage their economy is. And Sonic and I discussed this, but the Tucker Carlson, him simping for Russia, it's hilarious because
Oh yeah.
Tucker inadvertently, by saying how much it costs for groceries in Russia and saying, look how cheap it is. But when you compare it to the actual cost of living in Russia, it is not looking good. Like the economy in Russia is not
Mm-hmm.
doing well, and people are economic animals. They think about their wallet and they think about they think about their stomachs first and foremost. They
Yeah.
don't care about ideology in the long run. They don't care that they're fighting in Ukraine, to save Russia from Nazis and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
It
definitely.
was an opposite. It was like a reverse Gorbachev, right? I think it was.
Yeah,
Mhm.
well, I mean, well, that's what we talked about literally last night.
Yeah,
McGuire, have you heard about the grocery store that Boris Yeltsin went to?
or Yeltsin. Yeah,
Yeah. When he goes in and he goes, "Oh, there's so much meat here," or it's so
Yeah.
well stocked. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, my favorite picture from that is he's standing in the produce aisle and he's looking at this like, it's a pile of oranges and like as an American you're like, okay, cool, it's a pile of oranges, whatever. But his eyes are like,
Yep.
and it's like, I mean, you have to think about it. Like this guy, he was in it. I think he was in the Politburo in the Soviet Union, and he had never seen that many oranges except maybe at like a warehouse.
Right.
So
No, exactly.
yeah, I
It's,
mean, oh, go ahead.
oh, you're totally good. Keep going.
No, I mean, it's just I don't know, like the economics in Russia, the math doesn't add up, and I don't know how long they can keep this going. And haven't they been selling their gold reserves too to pay for all this stuff? Because I know they went back to the gold. Um, I know they went back to the gold standard, and you had guys cheering like, "Look, they saved their currency," and then like within a month, it went back to where it was basically because gold was leaving Russia, and I think Russia literally had to pass a law that said you cannot. It is illegal to take gold out of Russia. Which, I mean, if you can't trade gold for currency, you basically have a fiat currency that we pretty please promise to give you this money when we want, but we actually won't. So
Yeah, no, I remember that back and forth when the sanctions initially hit, when all of this happened in the first place. That was funny. I don't know about selling gold recently, but I do know like their primary export oil. They've been selling under global market value at an extreme
mhm.
loss to India and China.
China
Um,
mainly.
yeah, exactly, and it's it supports them in the sense that they're making revenue off of it, but relative to global oil values and relative to the amount of investment that they have to put in to extract oil, refine it, etc. Especially, there's been there's been airstrikes from Ukraine on oil
Mhm.
fields in southern Russia, right? There's
Yep,
been
in the
um,
Caucasus.
exactly there's been strikes on refineries that creates massive damage that's incredibly costly, especially for Russia, where you don't have an industrial capability to support repairing this industry. Uh, it's a self-perpetuating cycle. You're selling at a loss, so you can't afford your industry itself. And then the industry is collapsing partially due to man-made reasons, partially due to lack of maintenance and whatever. So you're more and more desperate. So you're selling at a greater and greater loss. It's not sustainable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is with the so they've been selling oil to India and China, and the funny thing
Mhm.
is, so Russia and China really don't like each other. They actually despise each other, and the only reason why they don't kill each other is because the U.S. is a bigger threat to the both of them. So it is a fragile alliance unified by hate, which as Crea from Knights of the Old Republic 2 said, an alliance united by hate is a fragile alliance at best. But it's funny because so Russia and China, they don't like each other, but they have this common enemy, but that doesn't mean they're going to be nice to each other. And it's funny that you say they're selling at below market value. The Chinese, they literally go to the Russians and they basically say, "How much do you need to not starve?" And the Russians
Mhm.
say this, and the Chinese say, "We will give you that." And it's like,
Mhm.
so if we're friends and you're hurting and you're saying, "Hey man, can you help me out?" You know, I'm gonna try to help you a little bit more than just barely above starving. I think so. It's really funny because China is really like, I don't like China, but it's hilarious because they're basically just getting oil almost for free, like because the Russians have to sell it so cheaply to them, and the
No,
Russians
absolutely.
they're just seething so hard because that's their main thing. Like oil and other natural resources are how Russia survives, and if they can't earn a premium or a good margin off their oil, they're they're boned. They're just absolutely boned. And we see it with their economy. Their economy is like almost at, I mean, it's at a stagnation right now, and it might be hitting a depression very soon because like I was saying with their gold reserves, they had to stop gold leaving their country. And it's like,
Mhm.
if you're not exporting anything of value and what you are exporting is like cheap, how does your economy function?
No, absolutely. It's incredible, and I think it really puts into perspective too. I haven't heard this in the last couple years, but when the invasion initially happened, the talk of the town was BRICS, right?
Yeah.
Um, I Nobody acknowledges the CSTO, but I mean, I guess theoretically that was
Baby
in
Bricks Jr.
yeah, exactly. But everybody's like, well, here's a new global axis, and it's incredible. You look at how BRICS members deal with each other.
Hate each
It's
other with a
exactly.
burning passion.
I mean, it's an economic alliance, and they're inflicting economic harm on each other. It's incredible. Um,
Did you
it,
hear that South Africa like put tariffs against Brazil because Brazil was, or yeah, Brazil was supporting Palestine in some way? It was like, oh
Mhm.
my god, like come on.
Well, and the even funnier part was the last BRICS meetup or whatever their annual conference. Putin physically could not show up because because it was hosted in South Africa, and South Africa said that they would arrest him if he entered the country. Um,
What a great friend.
I know. It's incredible. You look at the CSTO, which, in fairness, BRICS isn't a military alliance. It's just people who trade with each other, not well, but whatever. You look at the CSTO, though. Granted, Azerbaijan isn't in it anymore, but they fought with each
Oh
other.
no, they lost
Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Azerbaijan.
Yeah, Azerbaijan. Well, Azerbaijan. I can't pronounce it today.
Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan. There we go. There we go.
There we go.
Azerbaijan. Okay, I'm having a stroke. Bear
AZ,
with me.
AZ. Just say AZ.
Easy.
We got you.
Okay, AZ, and Armenia. In 2020, they went into like active open warfare with each other, and it was funny because Russia was supplying both sides too, because they're both in the same military alliance with each other. It's incredible. I mean, the instability in every international organization that Russia touches is just outstanding. And again, everybody talks about, oh, this is the next, next NATO. This is going to challenge the global order. It's not. They can't even challenge their own internal order. There's so much strife between these countries, and they've made zero headway in dealing with any of it. I mean, I can't believe it. It's a meme of itself.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of watching the Tim Pool podcast,
Oh,
and I love hate watch it because he's like Chicken Little. Like every day we're about to go into nuclear war with Russia, and
Yeah.
his other thing that he says is that like he's like BRICS is gonna take over. BRICS just did this, did that, and like it's hilarious because if you look at BRICS for 5 seconds, it's like
Mhm.
they're the most dysfunctional family ever. They
Oh,
don't get along.
absolutely.
They hate each other. They're constantly sanctioning each other. China wanted to be the reserve currency, and everyone in BRICS was like, "We are not going to use you as the reserve bank because we do not trust that you are not phoning in all of the money that you produce, and that this isn't all horse shit." And China was basically like, "Yeah, it kind of is actually."
Yeah, it's incredible. It's just it's outstanding. Oh.
I mean, I don't listen. I am not. I disagree with you two. I don't like the EU and I don't like NATO, but
Mhm.
like at least they have some like standards and they can function. And I like if I had to choose who's gonna be the world, like the evil thing that controls the world, I'd rather have it be the EU because it's just not incompetent. It's just not like BRICS is literally the clown car of economic blocks.
No, exactly. Exactly. Even if you strip away everything bad about BRICS and take, each country at face value, I mean, look at Chinese real estate. How's that doing? One of their largest industries on the verge of perpetual collapse every single day. Um, I mean,
No, you don't understand. All those buildings were made in case of nuclear war, so that when Chinese
yeah.
cities got nuked, the people had somewhere. We Sonic, for reference, the individual we were talking about yesterday, that was one of his theses as to why China was building ghost cities.
Oh.
And McGuire and I were just like, "You've got to be kidding me! You can't actually believe this." So, but there are people who believe that the Chinese ghost cities were there for nuclear war, like as separate places where people could go live.
No, isn't like
I
the official story, isn't it that they're just building it so people will move in eventually? Isn't that the whole thing?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's the government's position.
Oh, I mean, it makes sense,
yeah,
right?
if you keep perpetually spending money.
They've been doing it for years, right? Even with like some of their bigger cities that currently have thousands of inhabitants that used to be ghost cities, and then you kind of force people into these cities to live and work. So
But it's a little more complicated than that because it wasn't the Chinese Communist Party that was doing this, it was local governments that were doing this. But basically what they were doing is they were selling land to contractors to build buildings,
yeah,
and the local government would skim money. They would basically skim money off the top. Um, and the local contractors were selling these buildings, these apartments as like investment strategies, basically. So people would put Chinese, citizens would put money down on this soon to be apartment block, and they would say, "I'm going to own." It was like a condo, basically. "I'm going to own this condo and this apartment block in this city that's being built." But the problem is that a lot of these buildings weren't being finished because the companies would collapse because of all sorts of issues like COVID. COVID really stopped the Chinese housing boom because they stopped working, and so these companies went under, and it caused a massive problem because people were literally their investments were literally just disappearing. Like all the money they put on into the buying this apartment was just gone because the company collapsed.
yeah,
So
yeah, and that like it started with Evergrande, I think it was, and then it just recently, I think,
mhm,
in the last few months, happened to a different company that was even bigger, and with the housing market
yeah.
being 30% of the CCP revenue, it's really fucked over there.
Yeah, it's just another bubble. It's like it would be bigger than the 2008 recession, which it wouldn't be fun for us because, I mean, the US is kind of decoupling from China. We're not as reliant on China for trade, and it grows less and less every year, mostly because China's becoming actually ironically too expensive to produce in because their workers are actually demanding to be paid more. So China's their uh their marginal value is actually going down. Um, and their economic competitiveness is going down to like Bangladesh and Indonesia and even India, which is really kind of funny. Um, but yeah,
Well, and then just last year, Mexico actually surpassed China in uh,
auto parts
imports
sales,
and
right?
exports. Yeah.
Wow,
Yep.
crazy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
yeah,
But
we're back to being like number one trade partners again.
yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It's incredible, and you look at just where Chinese trade was with the United States a decade ago. It's incredible how much it's taken a turn. Um, but yeah, no, I can't say it's a bad thing. Even even if we say all of these ghost cities get occupied or whatever, um, speaking as an engineer, this the structural integrity of those buildings is just
Yeah,
subpar.
the
Um,
tofu material.
no, exactly.
Have
You
you heard
can
about that, Sonic?
Yeah, I'm like their buildings and stuff were just like collapsing because and like there's also some military stuff too, right? They're just putting water
Mhm.
instead of like fuel.
Oh,
Well, the water thing that is a hoax.
Oh, that was a
That wasn't
hoax.
an actual.
That wasn't real. Cool.
No, that yeah, I think that was some. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was some like Republican senator who repeated it, and then it just developed into its own story. There wasn't ever actual evidence of that.
Okay. I mean
yeah.
that's pretty funny story though. But,
No,
Listen,
absolutely.
listen. Is it possible? Yes. Is it
Yeah.
probable? No. But is
yeah,
it possible? Yes.
and it'd be really funny if that was true. But I have heard about the buildings collapsing because
Mhm.
it's just kind of shit over there. Their building standards are garbage.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. No, it is. It is a situation to be sure. And then, like I said, you figure the number of people who say this is going to be the next half of the world. It's insane. It's another one of those unsustainable situations, right? So much of this is inflated, just numbers on paper that don't back up reality. At some point, that's going to catch up to you. Um, and so it'll be an interesting day when that happens. Um, certainly will be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never subscribed to the Chinese. I've always thought of them as a paper tiger, not the rising tiger. Because they
Yeah.
would always say China's the rising tiger. They've always been a paper tiger. It's because production is important, but like it's about finished goods and finished materials. The U.S. was instrumental to winning World War II because we produced things. We produced a tank, we produced a rifle, we produced a ship. We produced end materials, and China produces a lot of intermediate goods, like it produces raw steel and whatever, plastics and things like that, which is important for production. But like the U.S. takes that, and it's funny because the U.S. actually has a lot of manufacturing, but a lot of people don't realize it. It's because we build a finished good. We build something with it that people go and use to do whatever. Whereas China, they make plastics, they make metals, they make and lots of cheap shit, honestly, which is nice. It's nice that we get cheap shit, but that cheap shit isn't used to in economic terms increase marginal utility. Whereas
Hmm.
what the US produces increases the marginal utility of whoever that end user is. And because of that, our economy is going to grow because we add a marginal value to the marginal utility, whereas China really doesn't. China, like, very incrementally adds marginal utility. And the thing is, anyone can produce what China produces. What they produce, not complicated at all. What the US produces, very complicated. You need lots of specialists, you need a lot of high tech equipment. And it's not just the US. I mean, like Europe, Japan, all these
Oh
places,
yeah.
but like China, I mean, what China produces, the reason why it's going to Bangladesh is because Bangladesh can produce it cheaper because their people don't require as much, income to live because their cost of living is low.
Hmm. No, it's incredible because people are aware of this too, right? You'll hear a lot, like it's some gotcha. Oh, well, made in America just means assembled in America,
Mhm.
but when you're assembled in America is a $1.5 million high redundancy precision guided missile that has never failed in its history. It's not like Legos. I think people have this idea that everything that happens in American manufacturing is Legos, but it's not. Um, and there's a reason why America performs so well technologically speaking because we have the skill base to support that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the resources. That's the United States is. It's not a niche, but I mean that's where we
It isn't
economically exist.
it isn't a niche. We produce a lot. It's just the stuff
Mhm.
we produce is stuff people use, not bullshit.
Right.
Yeah, and I like that
No,
we're
absolutely.
bringing more manufacturing, especially with the Chips Act, where we're trying to bring microchips and stuff and these processors into U.S. factories instead of it being imported elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not as much of a fan in government intervention in the market. I'm more ideologically pure about that. But I mean, I can at least appreciate the attempt to bring manufacturing back,
yeah,
especially chip production and things like that. And I do agree that it is foolish to put all of our eggs in Taiwan, which is right next to China, and China every 5 minutes threatens to invade Taiwan.
yeah.
Although I personally don't think China could invade Taiwan. That's a different discussion, but I don't think China has the capability to invade Taiwan.
Probably
But
not. No, but
no,
I,
I
I,
mean their military sucks.
I mean, yeah, uh, and the
I
alleged water in their
the,
fuel. So,
mhm. No, I think that the capability exists. It's just a question of cost. Because you look at this, you're looking at the largest maritime invasion in human history by
It
a
would be
very
insane.
wide. Exactly. It's in the region of the world with the highest concentration by such a wide margin of anti-ship missiles, right? Because this has been a problem for years. The anti-ship missile was developed for Taiwan. It's the use case for an anti-ship missile. There's so many batteries all over the place. And so you're looking at a massive invading force where you're sending tens of thousands of Marines on, very, very handsome radar targets for anti-shipping missiles all over Taiwan, right? All over Korea, all over Japan. All these countries have an interest too in using these weapons to defend Taiwan because if China makes landfall and by some means secures Taiwan, well, China's broken the natural blockade of China from the sea, right? Now they can operate a blue water navy on unchallenged, right? And so that creates a massive security risk to Japan and Korea and everybody else, right? Vietnam does routine naval exercises with the United States specifically for this because it's such a concern. It's literally just not feasible. The costs in doing so is so astronomical. You could be the best military power in the world. You could be the most prepared. You're shoveling
Invading
tens of thousands of
Taiwan,
people.
invading Taiwan from China, even if you're the U.S. with the United States Marine Corps, the best fighting force ever,
Hmm.
but the best amphibious fighting force ever. It's a hard sell. Even I mean, just the geography alone. Like even if Taiwan wasn't filled to the brim with anti-ship missiles,
Hmm.
the geography doesn't help because the problem is that all the western facing, not all, but a good portion of the western facing part of Taiwan is very mountainous and very, it's not just like
Hmm.
little rolling hills, it's like basically sheer cliffs that butt up against the ocean. And so the problem is that like if you had landfall, there's only a couple places you can land because um there's so much mountainous terrain over there on that side. And so if you're going to land in the west, you have a bunch of kill zones that you're going to be unloading men into, which is just a literal meat grinder.
yeah,
And so then the other option is you have to swing all the way around the east, which means one, the Taiwanese know you're coming, and then two, all their anti-ship missiles are going to be, blowing you up. So
Hmm.
just the geography just doesn't work out. Like even the Marine Corps would have a massive problem if it was invading from the west.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's the urban buildup too. Like you said, that it's very heavily mountainous on the the eastern half of the
Yeah.
country, right? So it's a very dense population. And obviously, the historical record shows dense urban environments are absolute hell to fight in.
It's dense, urban, mountainous. It's like both. The worst of both.
It's literally a worst case scenario. And what's the benefit of it? It's a propaganda win, I guess, for the Chinese state, who's sitting here for years and years and years saying this is ours. And then, like I said, they think it's an advantage in terms of blue water naval operations because China's entire coast is surrounded by not so friendly
it's the
countries.
inverse. It's the inverse. Their coast is so easy to invade. It's how the British, it's how all the colonial powers held power over China for so long. They literally, because their coast, like you can land anywhere basically on the coast of China, anywhere. It's crazy.
Nope, it's massive. It's exposed. It's
rolling beaches.
Yeah, the ideal, a marine's wet dream.
Yeah.
I know. I would love to go play in the sand.
Korea take 2. It went well the
Yeah.
first time. I mean,
Yeah, no kidding.
Do you think North Korea will ever try to invade South Korea? They keep threatening to do that as well.
No.
No.
It's not gonna happen. They can't. I mean, they couldn't invade the South. They would get destroyed. I mean, like how the Russian army is there to keep Russia in check, the Korean army is there to keep Koreans in check, North Koreans in check, and that's basically it. It's to be there to keep North Koreans in check, and if the South decides to do anything, they're gonna artillery bombards. Yeah, they're just gonna shoot artillery at Seoul from the mountains because Seoul is right next to the DMZ and within artillery range.
I mean, I'd even say Pyongyang.
And that's basically it.
Pyongyang's probably also in artillery range too for the South Koreans. No?
No, it's way up north. It is way up north.
It's like in central North Korea, but I mean, we have some really good artillery that can go like thousands of miles, don't we?
No. I mean, we have missiles that can go that far, but not artillery. I mean, if you consider, it looks like I'm just looking at a map. I would guesstimate about maybe
100 miles.
Yeah, 100 miles, which, I mean, in theory, you could make an artillery shot that far, but that is you need a good gunner, and you need the biggest artillery we got. So.
I mean, I'm just hoping that these authoritarian
you can do it with missiles.
I mean, yeah. I'm hoping these authoritarian regimes just collapse from the inside, because with Russia, that's looking very likely. With China, if the housing collapse does happen, there might be an internal coup of some kind, and then that would in turn fuck up North Korea as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, most authoritarian regimes do collapse from the inside. It's very rare that they collapse from the outside.
Yeah.
Like the Iraq War was an anomaly where we deposed Saddam, but most authoritarian regimes collapse. But the problem is that normally they're replaced with another authoritarian regime, and there's a reason for that, and it usually has to do with it has to do partly with how the previous regime collapsed and the current politics of the situation, the current the reality of the situation. Like the reason why the Soviet Union became what it was because they were fighting a civil war, and Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky basically were like, we can't afford to have good ideals right now. We just need to be brutal to everyone who stands against us. And then, that starts making it so that you have,
I mean,
rising authoritarianism, and then Stalin eventually takes power.
Well, but unlike with the USSR and the Russian Federation, we'll have these outside democratic nations that would have a heavy interest in supporting any future republic democrat nations, like what happened with North Korea, South Korea.
So let me ask you, why didn't that happen then when the USSR collapsed? Because they try to be democratic.
Sure. So
even though I hate that word, but that's a different discussion.
It was right after World War One. So everyone was still hurting a little bit, except for the U.S. But
no, I mean
there was
collapse
also
of the USSR.
Oh, the collapse of the USSR. Well, I mean they tried.
Yeah, you said.
Well, yeah. Well, they tried.
Yeah, they tried.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have really. It really wasn't a coup or anything. It was just like almost a 180 in economic policy, but with that sudden turn you end up having these like gangs, like basically take control of factories and stuff, and until like a state structure can help alleviate the problems. But
So basically, the reality of the situation necessitated them to be brutal in order to get to the good situation, but then only a brutal guy like Putin rises. So I mean, my thesis holds.
uh
That's my point, is that like it's gonna be this way
well,
just because like
if you don't maintain it, well,
go
also
ahead.
after the Cold War there was also a lot of anti-sentiment with sentiment with capitalism, etc. So you end up having this problem and this anti-West sentiment as well, internal to the Russians. So even if we did end up helping dissolve the Soviet Union and being it more democratic, there would still be a resistance to Western policy.
I do agree. I mean, the Russians were always suspicious of us. So I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with that. But I mean, I don't know. I'm just gonna firmly stay there because, and the other reason is there is a geopolitical reality with the actual geography of Russia, and it actually kind of makes it not possible to be a democratic regime, and that's partly because Russia is ruled literally the worst geography on Earth, and because of that, they have to have this authoritarian regime to maintain a state. Like McGuire and I were talking about earlier, the Russian nation kind of exists as it exists as a artificial state. It's not a natural state,
Yeah.
and that requires tyranny.
But your thesis doesn't quite hold in regards to North Korea, South Korea, right? Because it used to all be, in a sense, North Korea, this dictatorship, and then with the proxy wars and the Cold War, we ended up helping the revolution in South Korea, and they pushed, and then now you have this democratic regime in the South and this authoritarianship in the North. So because we help,
Yeah, but I mean
we directly help the Democrats in a sense. So
But the regime in the north is supplied by China, and
yeah,
the regime in the south is supplied by the U.S. And China and the U.S. are still existing, and so the north and the south will exist. I think North Korea will only collapse if China either does not necessarily collapses, but if they have like a really really bad recession or depression. And I mean, we kind of saw this with COVID when China was shutting down and they weren't shipping things. North Korea actually went through a small famine, and nobody talks about that. And North Korea like basically survives off of Chinese grain shipments.
yeah,
Like if China didn't ship the grain in, North Korea wouldn't exist.
yeah. But why wasn't the case that this coup in the South Korea, why didn't that become a dictatorship afterwards?
Because the US was supporting it.
Yeah. So if there was a coup in China or there's a coup in Russia, and the U.S. or other democratic nations supported it, then in turn they would probably be democratic as well. Which we didn't see that after the USSR collapse. There was none of that investment, so they still had that internal struggle.
Sure, but I mean, well, the other problem with the USSR
Yeah,
specifically is they had nuclear weapons, and there is no way in hell that whoever comes after, even if they do agree with the US, is going to just open up and say, "Yeah, you can come on." Like even France isn't entirely friendly with us, and the UK is only friendly with us because we speak the same language and we have a shared common history.
yeah,
Like in diplomacy, you don't have friends, you only have allies of convenience.
yeah. But it tends to be the case from what we see that if there's investment, so let's say there's several different coups. If there's investment with a democratic nation, they're going to invest in that democratic coup, and then from there, when they take power, they're going to still be democratic. They're most likely not going to be authoritarian.
I I don't think so, to be honest. I'm firmly of the opinion that democracies are rare. Like the reason why the US didn't become a dictatorship is because of the reality it was the reality of the situation kind of in reverse though, where it was all these separate states that considered themselves separate nations, but they were so small that they felt like they had to band together or die, which is where um where the original Gadsden flag comes from, which is uh, unite or die. And it's the snake divided up into all the different states. So
Yeah.
don't forget that, like, yeah, it would be great if Russia collapsed and a democracy emerged, but it's very unlikely that's going to happen because of the reality of the situation. We like nobody can ever take a break for 5 minutes to like time out and make a plan on what's going to happen, which is amazing with America because that's we made a plan while it was happening and we implemented it at the very end, which is very rare. Normally everything's French Revolution where they're going to cause the collapse of whatever and then figure it out later, but then that figuring out later actually turns into just a massive bloodbath.
Sure, but we only won the Revolutionary War because of France too, and then they had their revolution.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah, and then they had their revolution, but
and we didn't help them.
And we didn't help them. Yeah, I think if we did help them, if we did help them, then I think we would have saw it different. We would have saw it play different.
Maybe, but I don't really play counterfactuals, as you know.
Sure.
So whatever happened, and it was a bloodbath. So
yeah,
there it is.
Off with their heads. Let them eat cake.
Well, and that is how most revolutions happen. Most revolutions are very bloody. Like they're not the good revolution like America. They're the very dark revolution.
Yeah, like the Soviet Union, the French Revolution, this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we want to wrap up? We've been going for like more than an hour now.
Yeah, I have the time. It's been an hour 40. Does McGuire have anything to say about
we've been
any of our stuff?
Yeah.
Was that a no?
Silence is not consent. You have to say something.
Sorry, I repeat the question one more time. I got
he wasn't paying attention. He wasn't paying attention.
Off with his head.
Off with his head, yeah. Put him in the wood chipper feet first.
Yeah. Slowly though, please.
Do you have any final closing thoughts on anything we've said?
I don't think so. We've covered a lot of bases, but I think no. I am excited to see demographics with Russia. Okay, excited is a dark term. It will be interesting to see demographics with Russia in the coming years because we know there was a massive, in the wake of the Second World War, there was a massive drop in male population that has had profound impacts on Russian culture, and we're kind of seeing a repeat of that now. Massive number of young have been thrown into this meat grinder, and unlike Ukraine, they're not trying to conserve young working males of reproductive age, right? Ukraine's national policy is specifically to try to maintain the ability of the nation to reproduce and be economically viable. Russia isn't necessarily doing that, so it's going to be interesting to see the impacts of that. And building on what Delta just said about Russia not being able to be a democratic nation, I think that kind of loops back in. You talk to so many, especially older Soviet citizens, and how rough they are, how harsh they are. A lot of that's a reflection of a tough, hard working culture that is due to this loss of working age men, and a lot of it is due to a massive traumatized population. That obviously alcoholism, that's a stereotype, but it reflects reality, right? They're a massive, continuously war torn, continuously traumatized population, and this is literally the next nail in the coffin for that, right? It's a repeat in terms of scale. If you take that 1.5 million statistic that Sonic mentioned earlier at face value, it's a repeat of the Second World War. So it'll have detrimental impacts. It'll go to it'll help support the status quo of the Russian state, right? There might be another collapse. There might be another 1991, but it'll be another cycle that we've observed over the last 30 years. That's kind of what I predict. Because of the demographic effect of this war, it's just so massive and so unprecedented in scale. For Russian warfare in the 21st century, and it'll be dramatic for sure.
Yeah, I think the Republicans had it all wrong a couple years ago. They shouldn't have sent all the illegals to democratic democratic cities. They should have just sent them all to Russia.
Yeah, that would have unironically helped improve a lot of situations.
Yeah.
That's another thing though. I saw at one point, I'll have to dig out the statistics again. There's a projected growth for the United States over the next 100 years. It's incredible. I don't know. I don't remember where I saw it off the top of my head, and it could have just been completely fabricated. It was just an infographic that cited some government agency, but apparently the United States population is projected to continue to increase over the next 100 years.
Yeah.
And at current rates, there's a massive population decline in Europe, which is true, but I guess they're predicting a massive decline in China too, which is also evident if you look at their age pyramid.
Yep.
They don't have children, so
Yep.
literally we're approaching a point where the United States is literally at an upturn when children are becoming a very scarce commodity.
Yeah.
So that will be very interesting. I've thought about this a lot. You know, you look at history and there's so many massive international empires that, you know, seem like they popped up for 80 years and then they disappeared. You know, you think of the British, not they weren't necessarily temporary like that, but you know, the Dutch, for
The
example, they
Romans.
come to mind when I think of somebody. Exactly. Well, not the Romans. The Romans had their millennia. I think there's a couple different European nations specifically that come to mind though that were internationally very significant for a very short period of time. And I've often thought about whether or not the United States will find itself in that sort of position over the next century, but that's not going to be the case. The demographics are astounding if you compare them across the globe.
Well,
so that'll be interesting too.
yeah, I think a big thing is how we handle immigration, because yes, you do end up seeing post-industrial revolution, there is a massive dip in population. However, you help with immigration to help keep population numbers up because they tend to have more kids and stuff. So, but a lot of neo-Nazis and fascists and stuff will say that's a terrible thing and only have like Christian conservatism, whatever. Only the white people can have kids and all that shit. But that's how you collapse an entire population.
No,
Maybe that's something we should discuss next time on Dragon Ball Z.
On Dragon Ball Z, Frieza defeated.
Yeah. Frieza immigrated to the U.S. at one point, and then Trunks was there to deny his visa with a sword by cutting him in half.
The only thing I remember, I never watched Dragon Ball. The only thing I know about Dragon Ball is that, like, oh, will Goku die? Will Goku survive? Find out next time on Frieza defeated.
Well, it doesn't even matter because if they die, they just scream for 20 episodes and then launch a spirit bomb and win the day.
I don't know. I just think that was really funny because
I've described every.
Yeah,
Oh,
but I just thought it was really funny because the whole thing was like the Frieza and Goku fighting and Goku's team or whatever. They were all fighting Frieza. Frieza looked like that he was winning, and then all of a sudden it was like, find out next time. Frieza defeated, and it was just really funny because that spoiled the entire episode and the entire arc they had put in. It just spoiled it before.
Thanks, Funimation.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Well, my final thoughts. Wait. What's your final thoughts, Sonic? What's your final thoughts?
The Republicans should have sent all the illegal immigrants to Russia.
Oh yeah.
And China.
See, we've gone so far down that we had to go back to final thoughts. All right. My final thoughts are: we didn't start the fire. The world's always been burning ever since it's been turning. It's that really cheesy song, but I mean, all the stuff we've discussed. It's like there's so much history to it, and I urge anyone and everyone, please just read some goddamn history. Like read the primary sources, like read the documents. I read the Supreme Court what they said, like, because they published it. Don't just take what other people said for granted. Don't even take what I said for granted. Like we live in such a time with so much information. It's really not that hard to find information that is good and to make an assessment off that and not sound completely stupid.
Absolutely.
And you can find all of that information on the Schizo site called thelostmuse.net.
I thought we weren't going to say stuff like that. Yes, but my Schizo website, thelostmuse.net, please read.
You already referenced it once, so.
In fact, it's not just don't read, you're required to read it.
Yeah.
First bookmark. It's my home screen, believe it or not.
Yeah. Yeah,
Jesus
don't
Christ.
listen to dumb.
I hope not.
Yeah, don't watch CNN, don't watch Fox, only read thelostmuse.net. Only.
Read me. Read
That should
me.
be all your source of media.
What's your source? My source is me. Yes, I did cite myself. I did use myself as a source.
What's your source? I made it the
Wikipedia would let
fuck
you do
up.
that.
Unironically, I made myself up. I made my own source. I unironically made it the fuck up.
Yeah. Now read Rawls. Read. You got any book
Read
recommendations other than Rawls?
Oh, should we do a book of the week that we all recommend?
Oh, that would
I
be
recommend.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do that.
I recommend Progress in Poverty by Henry George.
Okay, George.
By Henry George.
Okay.
Yeah.
McGuire.
Oh boy, I don't know. I was reading Locke, the first treatise on government. So
That's a good one.
It's actually hilarious. It's a comedy. So I fully support picking that
good.
up. He has some good zingers. So
He does. I recommend everyone read Dune. All the Dune books. They're really good. And I saw the Dune movie recently, and I recommend everyone read the books.
Yeah. You
Oh,
should
no
also
kidding, okay.
read the Communist Manifesto.
No. Well, I mean, yes, but no.
know thy enemy.
Yeah, know the enemy. Alrighty. We're about 2 hours in.
Alrighty. Well,
150.
it was nice talking to y'all.
Yeah.
As well.
See you later, alligator.
See you all next time.
Woo.
Terrific.
If there is one.
Adios.
Ciao. Alright. And it's ended.